Hi everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about production level serverless solutions. So 3 key areas to consider when you're building out enterprise level serverless solutions. So a little bit about me. Been working in serverless since late 2014, thereabouts. Worked for companies like BT, AO.com and Sage PLC. Been doing this for about 18 years now. Worked as a principal developer and cloud architect for the last 6 years. I'm an AWS community builder. I'm currently going through my certs, going for that kind of gold jacket, which is like 11 certs. We'll see if we get there. I do a lot of blogging, speaking, and busy writing a serverless book with Pack Publishing. And last week just started as a global serverless architect at CEF. So the 3 areas I'm going to talk about is prototypes are easy, production is hard. So how do we go from prototyping quality to production quality? Event-driven architecture, so the importance of event-driven first mindset when we're building them out. And architecture layers. So this is like a conceptual way of thinking about, serverless for enterprise, essentially. So some people might have seen this tweet before. So this is Elon Musk saying prototypes are easy and production's hard, and that's exactly what it is with serverless. So if we look at a typical solid stack, so you've got a React app in S3, say API gateway or app sync for your APIs. You've got Lambda for your compute layer, and you've got DynamoDB. So within 2 hours, typing away, SLS deploy, very, very easy. I'm sure everyone could do that very, very quickly. And this is what typically happens. So inadequate login, no disaster recovery. A lot of teams forget about that. GDPR issues, so compliance and lack of it. No reporting, so unable to be data-driven. And sometimes just not secure. And this is where it comes to kind of the Dunning-Kruger effect and how that works with serverless. So you'll see over here, you've got, knowing only a little bit about serverless and getting started, and confidence is very high. And a lot of the time, that's where solutions are not secure, not scalable, tightly coupled. And then some people, as they look at which service do I use like Terraform, do I use serverless framework, CDK, so much to think about, so many AWS services, each with its own config. Sometimes teams can drop into that kind of valley of despair where there's just so much to think about. And then over time, obviously, as they get comfortable, you get to that kind of slope of enlightenment to where, you've got that plateau of sustainability. And that's where you've got, scalable, fault-tolerant, compliant, secure, and cost-effective solutions. So how do you put guardrails in place for teams when they're just kind of starting out with serverless? So one approach is tactical DDR, which is basically looking at non-functional requirements and putting them into the right place within the SDLC. So definition of ready, looking at things like serverless threat modeling, authorization, compliance, and then kind of progressing that work until you get a kind of definition of done. And obviously before that's getting pushed to production, you're thinking about caching, load testing, DR, adequate testing, and documentation. So what does that acronym stand for? So threat modeling. So has the proposed architecture been threat modeled, especially serverless threat modeling? Authorization. Have we considered authorization? Is it adequate? Have we looked at least privilege? Compliance, have we thought about GDPR and PII? Might be PCI DSS compliance, for example, as well. Testing, have we got adequate testing, end-to-end, visual, smoke testing? Internationalization, so a lot of teams start building out services with their serverless services without thinking about what happens if we need to deploy to the US next. What about France? It's a lot of duplication. And that's kind of full stack, obviously, with internationalization. Caching, could we benefit from caching to improve the cost or latency? Auditing, so do we actually know what's happening within the system, whether that's down at CloudTrail level, whether that's actual auditing logs, whether that's auditing what an internal member of staff's doing. Load testing, so is it going to scale? So obviously serverless should scale, but what about downstream services and kind of third-party services? DR, do we have disaster recovery in place? What's the RPO and RTO? Documentation, have we got ADRs, architecture decision records, diagrams, open API and Swagger, etc. and reporting. So once we actually push something, do we understand in a data-driven way, what can we understand off the back of actually pushing a feature, for example? So why do we need this approach? So threat modeling missed attack vectors, which make us vulnerable. Authorization, obviously open to attack by malicious actors. Compliance, if we talk about GDPR, you've got fines of up to 17.5 million or 4% of turnover. Testing, just poor solutions and unhappy customers. Internationalization, you've got full rewrites just to actually move to different locales. Caching, higher costs and slower potentially for the customers. Auditing, unable to track who's actually doing what within your actual services. Load testing, major issues when you hit unexpected traffic. DR, so somebody thinks they're in staging, clears out a database, and all of a sudden they realize they're in prod. How do you actually get that back? Documentation, just poor developer experience, cognitive load of understanding services, how they interact, architecture, diagrams, that kind of thing. And like we said, reporting, so unable to see how features are performing. So obviously you've got the well-architected framework, which covers all of this, but teams typically leave this until the very last minute, from what I've seen. And if anyone's used it, it's massively verbose. You've got quite a lot of screens to go through if you're doing like the serverless lens, for example. Lots to think about. And then if you leave it to the end, you've got a ton of rework. So this approach essentially complements it and puts those guardrails in place for teams just when they're starting out, just so they're thinking about these things early doors before you actually start getting issues. So obviously they can complement each other. I've got 2 articles here that I wrote a while back on tactical DDR and serverless threat modeling, if anyone's interested in reading those at a later date. So event-driven architecture, so the importance of an event-driven first mindset with serverless solutions. So typically when teams start out, you see a lot of this, where you'll have different teams starting to spin up salad stacks, as I was calling them earlier. And it's very easy just to call each other HTTP, synchronous calls between them. And typically what we get is increased overall latency, and it's just massively brittle, obviously, compared to event-driven architectures. So an example here, we've got a database on fire, and all of a sudden that knock-on effect takes out essentially the full service, and you've got that kind of distributed monolith, tightly coupled and intrinsically linked. And over time, obviously, as companies grow, I've seen it at various places I've been where you've got 2 or 3 serverless teams, and all of a sudden that scales out to like 40 teams, and you can just end up in this big ball of mud. And I've seen it happen quite a few times, to be honest, where you've just got all this complexity of synchronous calls. You're doing a lot of mocking when you're doing any kind of testing, and it's a bit of a nightmare. So obviously the async approach is to have loosely coupled architectures, only interacting mainly between with events, eventually consistent in nature. And that way, they're completely decoupled, as much as you can do, obviously. And you can utilize if one service goes down, things like dead letter queues, obviously, to kind of replay those events. So exactly the same as what we had before. Database goes on fire, all of those events are sitting in DL queues, the rest of the services are up, so at a later date, replay the events, and obviously your customers don't know what's actually gone on, and everyone's happy. So importance of being event-driven, so domain services are individually testable, so again, you don't have to mock a ton of APIs, which becomes quite complex and tiresome. Domain services should be individually deployable. So again, in event-driven architectures, that makes it a lot easier. Centralized shared version schemas. So there should be an understanding across an enterprise what an event looks like, and they should be versioned. Domains should have their own data stores, obviously including read stores based on events. They should be totally decoupled. So like we said, a fault with one service wouldn't affect the rest of your enterprise, and they can scale independently. So what is an event? So for a lot of teams that are kind of new to event-driven architectures, an event's a change of state within a domain, essentially. And that's something that's immutable. It's something that's happened. the rest of the services can essentially listen to that event and do something off the back of it. So you've got order created here, a perfect example. But you also have commands, which is an intent aimed at basically another domain to do something, and that's quite rare. But it could be something like send email. It's an asynchronous task. You just want it done. You're not bothered really when that happens. It's eventually consistent. And you're basically given the email service in this case. The email service would deal with any kind of retries, any errors. It's almost like fire and forget. So this is where Event Bridge, in my opinion, should be used as your default for event-driven architectures. So basically, enterprise event bus across your organization. The reason for that is no servers to manage or maintain. You've got the schema discovery and schema sharing. So we talked about sharing events and versioned events across an enterprise. You've got content-based filtering. So raising events, should I actually consume this event? Am I bothered? So you can basically do that kind of fine level rather than a domain having to look at the event and say, no, I'm not actually interested. You can do that. Input transformation. So if you want to go from Event Bridge to API Gateway, you can do that transformation, build up the DTO in the exact shape you want it, and that's very versatile. And archive and replay. So just being able to replay events to maybe populate a read store somewhere. And that's where obviously it's very important that your services are idempotent. So replaying the same events over and over again isn't going to cause things like double payments or allocating stock 2 or 3 times. So that's kind of covered at the top bit there. So consider idempotency. So AWS typically say you'll get guaranteed once delivery, but you can get the same message over and over again. And I've seen that quite often be 2, 3 times, if not more. So your service should be able to take that event and not do the same thing over and over again. Definitely use queues, batches, queues and batches for failures. So again, ensure we can replay them and it's resilient in case you've got some kind of issue. Version events, so no break-in changes, just like you would with APIs. Event carried state transfer, so these events should have all information needed. It shouldn't be, say, an order ID and an API call to go back the way, because again, you're just intrinsically linking that synchronously back. Try and have as much information on there as possible. The use of correlation and causation IDs. So passing those through, obviously, when it comes to distributed architectures with serverless, you can start tracking, a request as it makes its way through. And one thing to think about is latency. So Event Bridge is around 100 milliseconds. So if you need really, really quick, much shorter latency, maybe look at SNS over Event Bridge. So I've talked a lot about events, so are APIs bad? Definitely not. So obviously it's the right approach at the right time. So when I'm working with teams, I typically say if you can be event-driven and eventually consistent, then you're going to reap the rewards of doing that. But there's going to be times, we've got here 4 examples, where you just synchronously need up-to-date, accurate data from another domain. You might not be the owner of that data and you don't have your own read store. You may need additional information, so not all information was on the event. And some features just need to be synchronous, so like a payment and getting a payment ref back, So we'll cover a little bit of this in the next section, which is architecture layers. So again, there's an article I wrote maybe 2-3 months back, and that covers this in more detail. It kind of has examples, and there's also a repo you can pull down and play with as well. So architecture layers. So this is basically a conceptual way of thinking about how you build serverless architectures across an enterprise, rather than teams just working in silos. So the reason we need this and why domain-driven design is so important is what we can end up with is a Lambda pinball architecture, where you've essentially got domain leaks. So your domain logic is very anemic across your domain service. It's across lambdas, step functions. It's not reusable because of the way it's been written. Things like duplication of effort. So we should be looking at cross-cutting concerns rather than each team duplicating the same thing over and over again. No aggregate root. So domains essentially interacting with other domains' internals. So maybe an internal SNS topic, or even worse, sometimes going directly to a database, which I've seen a lot of. We should think about architecture layers for poor developer experience. We definitely don't want that. We should have developer platforms for common tasks. And again, like we said before, we don't want tightly coupled architectures, so very brittle architectures. Can everyone see that? I know it's quite small there. So like I say, this is like a conceptual way of thinking about it across these different layers. So the top layer is the experience layer. We've got a cross-cutting concerns layer, domain platforms, data layer, and digital platforms and developer experience. So if we look at the top layer, what that typically is an experience layer. That might be Alexa apps, it might be mobile apps, it could be internal applications that you use, it could be a website. And typically they would have back-end for front-end APIs. So each of those can have their own authorization. So you might have SSO internally, but then you might have on an Alexa app, completely different authentication. And then cross-cutting concerns. So this is things like authentication, aggregated login, tracing, telemetry. A couple of examples at the bottom there, but this is the kind of differentiated heavy lifting. So you don't want all teams thinking about the same things. So if we look at this as an example, as your serverless teams start growing out, what you sometimes find is each of those teams in isolation are looking at authentication, aggregated login. They're speaking to different suppliers. You might have New Relic, Lamigo in there, and just no standardization. And that includes comms as well. You might find that you've got each of the teams sending out different emails, different text messages, where really you could have a service that does that in one place for developers to work from. So the next one is the kind of domain platforms, and this is where you've got your well-encapsulated domains, which should only be really accessible via well-defined APIs, so REST, we talked about synchronous, and public events. So these are public events between domains and not internal, obviously, events within a domain. So the reason for this is, in this example here, if we look at having that domain logic that's common within this particular domain service, that means you've got an Alexa app here and you've also got a website. Rather than duplicating that logic and sticking it in these back-end for front-end APIs, which could extrapolate out and you could have a lot of different kind of experience layers, it just means it's utilized in one place and you don't have that kind of domain leak across different kind of stacks and serverless services. And then underpinning all of this is your kind of data layer. So this would be things like Event Bridge, like we said earlier, with event-driven architectures. And this allows basically domain services to talk to each other with public events, well-defined. But also your backend for front-end APIs can be raising events, and that could be something like, in this example, you've got Alexa. You could run something through sentiment analysis and understand, is that customer happy? Are they not happy? And build up that kind of one view of a customer based on events. And that goes to things like reporting and analytics as well. So off the back of Event Bridge, populating some kind of data lake that you can report on. Again, as a kind of cross-cutting concern. And finally, digital platforms and developer experience. So again, things like creating a VPC, creating a pipeline, creating an AWS account. Serverless teams don't want to be doing that. It should be cookie cutter, rinse and repeat, and there should be a way of doing that under some kind of platform. Consolidated APIs, so we've got Backstage there. So that's a prime example where developers should have one place to go to in an enterprise where they can view all kind of Swagger documents or versioned events across the enterprise, make it very easy for serverless teams to work with each other. And authentication platforms. So if you think of those domain services talking to each other, that's typically a client credentials grant flow that most of us would have used. With that, you don't want every single team having to think about Cognito or Auth0. Create a digital platform, have authentication. So you could have Cognito in its own AWS account, React app on the front of it, or you could use something like Apogee and just make it very easy for developers to actually do this and just reduce the cognitive load on teams. So summary of that is obviously no domain leak, so well-defined domains following DDD, domain reuse, so reusable logic, so you don't have that kind of domain logic being spread across serverless architectures. Increased agility, you want your serverless teams to just move really, really quickly. You should be pushing changes daily. Take that cognitive load and heavy lifting off teams. And loosely coupled architectures, which obviously we've talked about there with enterprise serverless buses there with Event Bridge. So as a conclusion to that, these are just kind of 3 approaches that you can take when you're building out your serverless teams on an enterprise. And if anybody wants more information on these, obviously it's almost been like 3 small talks in one. I'm happy to kind of have a chat about it. So thank you for listening. Has anyone got any questions at all?
Sorry. Are your slides available online at all?
Yeah, I can share those. Yeah, definitely.
When you talk about event-driven architectures, concurrency and event ordering, how do you deal with those sorts of things?
So a lot of the time that's actually, programming around it, looking at FIFO queues with Event Bridge, which is a bit of a nightmare, to be honest, to actually do that. So I've actually got a repo with the event-driven architectures one, which shows you how you can actually do that. Because by default, you get that same thing where you can get duplicated messages. Each within Event Bridge will have its own message ID. And because of that, when it comes to the FIFO queue, it's going to look at the 3 and think they're completely separate. So there is a repo there you can pull down and have a bit of a play around with it. So definitely ways to architect around it.
So the layers
Yep.
slide, right, has all the layers in. You've got each kind of front end, each client has its own API, which then talks to the individual service API. What's the
Yep.
purpose of having them for each service rather than having the API itself?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess if you think about an Alexa app with its own API, that's going to need its own authentication, essentially. We're talking like very thin back-end for front-end APIs here that don't have a lot of logic. That logic would just be synonymous with the actual UI itself. So whether it's an Alexa app, whether it's a website, if it's an internal app, so it's something within an organization, you've got SSO and it's kind of tied down. Obviously, you might be using something like Azure AD. So that allows you to kind of decouple that. But having that then have the actual domain logic itself in that kind of domain layer, then you can reuse it across all of those different APIs. Otherwise, what you typically find is definitely when different teams are working on these customer experiences, they all just duplicate that same logic, that business logic. And then if something changes, you have to change that in all places. But it also means that, that domain logic is also available to other domains based on events. So it could be order created event. It may not have anything to do with the actual kind of customer experience layer. It may just be off the back of that happening, the pricing domain wants to do something. Or it could be a command to say, go and do something with that business logic.
Okay.
Like I say, these are just kind of conceptual. Otherwise, what you find is, if you look at serverless architectures compared to N-tier architectures, it used to be website, you'd have your main kind of compute, so your APIs, and then you'd have a database. With serverless, obviously, you've got API gateway speaking to DynamoDB, one endpoint could be going to a step function, which then's going off and doing something else. So if we don't think about this as we start building out, that business logic does just completely leak. And it's that kind of, like I say, cognitive load and understanding of what's happening where.
I guess with event-driven service discovery kind of goes away, doesn't it? It's the onus is on the consumer to do what it wants to do, rather than the onus being on the producer to send something somewhere.
Yes, you don't have that link between the two. And if you're raising events, it just means at a later date, somebody can consume that event and do something off the back of it. So you're setting yourself up for the future as well. So with my teams, what I typically say is, even if nobody's consuming it yet, start raising the events regardless.
What would your strategy be to convince a company with a bag of wet spaghetti, like you showed in that bowl of mud, to become more event-driven when they're addicted to HTTP calls?
That's a good question, to be honest. I think a lot of it's just showing the value. So some of the companies I've worked for recently have been like that, behind the scenes. And it's a case of just showing them with one slice. What can you do with one slice to decouple it? So if you've got a monolith that is spaghetti code, just show them the real value. And I think that's where if you are data-driven and you can understand you've pushed that small feature, that thin slice, what are the benefits, and kind of get buy-in. Yeah, it's not easy.
So basically, do it behind their backs and show it to them.
I guess you can do it incrementally anyway. So evolutionary architectures, I guess you should always be looking at your architecture and slowly chipping away at it, you know, kind of trying to reduce that tech debt anyway. But it is obviously hard when it is, you know, so synchronous with so many different calls. It's definitely not easy, but obviously you can do it.
I noticed you called what's the front end layer, the experience layer. So is it okay if I call myself an experience engineer?
Yeah.
We put experience engineer, sounds weird.
Sounds better on the CV.
Yeah. I've never heard it described as that experience layer. I like it.
Yeah, it's mainly because obviously, you know, it isn't just websites. I guess it could be voice. It can be, you know, even with Alexa now, it can be visual, obviously. Cool.
The architecture you described there, is that currently how CEM works?
No, because I've been there a week. I kind of do that in a week.
And so I guess that question still applies. Is that how it works? Do they have a legacy stack?
So they do have a legacy stack. They have, well, a hybrid of legacy, some on-prem and some of the newer stuff. Obviously, I've put there if anybody does want to look at some of the roles at CF, we are hiring at the moment. So serverless, I think a couple of serverless architects, serverless engineers, a couple of other roles, but reaching out to Tom Delaney. He's a great guy and, you know, definitely worth having a chat if anybody is interested in CF.
And the reason I ask is interviewerships. It basically is that I think every company has this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wants to be event-driven and has HTTP logic, like 9 APIs deep, and when one of them breaks, it all breaks. And they want, so desperate to get away from it.
Yeah, and you know, I came from EO.com before this, and this was a case of at that kind of enterprise level, working with the EA and working with other architects to say, as a group, how do we kind of show the benefit of this? And a lot of kind of showing these kind of slides as well with these architecture layers and just showing the value of it, essentially. But you're totally bang on. Cool. So basically, they sell, if you think of something like Screwfix, it's like Screwfix on steroids, because it's literally, it's a global company. We're in the US, UK, Australia, Spain. I think we've got something like close to 400 stores in the UK as well, these kind of small outlets. Physical stores as well, yeah. So, but yeah, it's a very interesting place to be. Serverless first mentality, which is great. Event-driven first mentality. So it's been great working there for the last week and a half. So yeah, definitely a good place to be, I would say.
And already using the word we. We are.
I know. Yeah, exactly. And a great office as well, based in Durham, if anyone's kind of over that way. Very Google-esque with kind of pool tables and PlayStations. Maybe, yeah. Hopefully, because I could do with one. So
Whereabouts is the office in Durham?
it's classed as Meadowfield, I think it is.
Okay.
So I don't know Durham very well. So I'm like 10 minutes from here, to be honest. But yeah, the people are fantastic as well, and they've got buy-in from the top. So it's definitely a great place to be. Cool. But if anyone's got any questions as we're having pizza and beers, obviously just give us a shout, definitely. And thanks for listening as well. Really appreciate it. Cheers, everyone.